Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast. Today we have a special episode on Who Are the Mongols, and I'm joined by Jack Wilson, professionally known as the Jackmeister. He has numerous materials on the Mongols across the internet. And would you like to start off by introducing yourself, Jack?
I certainly would. Thank you very much for the kind words. Yes, I have been writing publicly about the Mongol Empire online since 2016 or so. I'm currently in the third year of my PhD at the Central European University in Vienna, Austria, and the majority of my PhD research and my published articles mostly focus on the Golden Horde, uh, the Mongol ruled successor state, ruling what is now the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, in the late 13th century. But in terms of the work I have done online for both my own personal YouTube channel, the Jackmeister Mongol History, as well as a lot of work for the channel Kings and Generals and their podcast series, I've written for them. I've written on all aspects of the Mongol Empire, all of the Khanates, the early history, decline, fall, you name it. There's a chance I've written something about it somewhere online.
Yeah, and for listeners who aren't aware, the Kings and Generals has a completed series on the Mongols. I think it's about 150 episodes or so, right?
It was something there was about 90 something, I think, written episodes like that I wrote, and then the remainder are interviews I did with historians, archaeologists.
Yeah, so if you want more detail than you're going to get in this podcast, you can go and have a listen to that one.
But Kings and Generals Ages of Conquest was what the name was that we worked under. I don't know if it's still. They have another series that's running after that on the China, basically after the Mongols, more or less.
So let's start at the beginning. Where did the Mongols appear from? How are they related to some of the other steppe peoples and confederations that had gone before them? And yeah.
All right. Well, so the state that we call the Mongol Empire was formally declared in northern Mongolia in the year 1206. That is when the warlord Temujin takes the title of Chinggis Khan, which is more usually rendered into English as Genghis Khan. But Chinggis Khan was how everyone up until the 20th century tended to call him. When Chinggis Khan declares this state in 1206, this is not an ethno-state or anything like that. This is a group of peoples speaking Mongolic and Turkic languages and some languages that were heavily influenced by both, who were brought together under Mongol rule, with Mongol, as we should tend to see with most steppe polities. Mongol is the dynastic name, this political name, not necessarily an ethnic name. Although there is within this Mongol polity, the upper class is almost speaking predominantly Mongolian, and perhaps some of them are bilingual in some Turkic languages as well. Now, in terms of the early history of the Mongols before that, things get a bit hard to trace, because there is always a Mongolic language speaking element in the Mongolian steppe, and some of these elements go on to establish empires. For example, the Roran Khaganate, probably the ruling elite there in the 5th century, are speaking a Mongolic language. You have the Khitan, who established the Lao dynasty in rural parts of North China and the Mongolian steppe from the 10th century to the early 12th century. They speak a para-Mongolic language. So that's a language that splits off from the ancestor of Mongolian in the, probably, again, 5th century or so. And the Khitan, they move westwards with the advance of the Jurchen dynasty. They established the Kar Kitai, and it's from the Kar Kitai that many languages would start to call North China Kitai, and or I guess rather the Khitan state, the Lao dynasty, and then the Kar Kitai together kind of make this idea of Kitai as the name for northern China, which I believe still is in Russian today, Kitai, and hence in English, cafe, which is often how, if you read an old translation of Marco Polo, they'll always render it as Katai there. So the Mongols, though, in the centuries before the establishment of the Mongol Empire, are kind of more of a very minor group within the Mongolian plateau. It's mostly dominated by Turkic-speaking peoples, or especially in the western half of the Mongolian plateau. And over the centuries, especially following the conquest of the Khitan in the 10th century, you have many waves of these Turkic speakers moving west. And these are the ancestors of who become later known as the Kumin Kipchak people, Conley, Oberli, some of whom you have heard about in this podcast already. And by the time of the 12th century, the Khitan state collapses with the rise of the Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty, a Tungusic-speaking people, ancestors of the Manchu, which causes another wave of migrations out of the Mongolian plateau. This is the establishment of Kar Kitai. But in this power vacuum after the fall of the Lao dynasty, the Khitan-ruled empire, that's when you start to see the ancestors of Chinggis Khan starts to assemble some sort of state, which becomes known to modern historians often call it the Hamak Mongol Ulus, which would translate to like all of the Mongol people, literally. So there's some debate about whether it even was, these references to it are actually supposed to be an empire versus just a reference to everyone in Mongolia or something like that. So when Chinggis Khan comes into the scene at the end of the 12th century, start of the 13th century, he's presenting himself as this kind of member of this steppe aristocracy, a guy whose ancestors were claiming to be rulers of all the Mongols, even if they weren't necessarily that in actuality. And from approximately the year 1180 onwards, Temujin, his personal name, Temujin Han, is fighting a war as ends up going against all of the other major steppe lords in the Mongolian plateau, probably not with the aim of actually unifying the Mongols or creating a new empire, but probably towards this a sense at least of security for his own position initially. Probably his original goal was to confirm his status as a warlord in the service of the Khan of the Kariad Khanites, a fellow named Onghan Toro. And this evolves into Temujin fighting to be his successor, and then finally, rather than being his successor, it's the establishment of an entire new polity, and that is the Mongol Empire in 1206. Now, that's slightly of a different version than maybe some listeners may be familiar with in terms of the Mongol Empire, and this has been part of some side work of mine for a little while now. It's trying to move past this image of the rise of the Mongols that relies wholly on the Mongol imperial sources, where you get kind of this preferred narrative of where the Mongols come from, and kind of reading a little bit in between the lines, looking at what archaeology has to say, things like this. And the image we get is more of not Temujin, the man dreaming of unifying the Mongols, but Temujin, kind of a bit of this third-rate warlord who ends up rising to this position of ultimate power and doesn't have this dream of conquering the world or anything like that. That appears in a lot of literature, that in 1206 he declares he's going to take over the world kind of thing. this is something that is probably not present in the initial Mongol imperial ideology until probably the very end of Chinggis Khan's life, after the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. And as historian David Morgan said, or summarized, I'm going to paraphrase here, the Mongols kind of come around to the idea of conquering the world when they find out they're kind of doing so. And it becomes maybe this explanation, or how else could we be winning all these great victories in northern China and Central Asia if not for the fact that heaven wanted us to rule all of this? And
must be destiny.
Of course, how else would you explain it? And this belief in world conquest becomes formalized during the reign of his son and successor Ögedei Khan from 1229 to 1241. And it's under Ögedei that you start to see conquests carried out for the sake of conquest. And it's at this point that the Mongols launched the campaign, which conquers all of the western steppes and the Rus principalities over the late 1230s and early 1240s.
So this is more a story of opportunism than one man out dreaming about creating an empire.
And it becomes after the fact. They go, yes, this was always the point from the get-go. We were always going to do this. You sometimes hear some 19th or 20th century elite of the British Empire would say the point of the empire was to pacify and civilize the whole of the world. But that wasn't really the point in the 17th, 18th century kind of thing. But it's handy afterwards to make up a justification for why you're ruling all of these peoples around the world.
So when we talk about imperial sources, and that this is mainly the secret history of the Mongols, or other stuff around?
So the secret history of the Mongols is the first of these. So what this is, for those who don't know, this is our oldest extant Mongolian language written history. Which was most likely produced in the year 1252 on the order of Mongol Khan, grandson of Chinggis Khan, who becomes the great Khan of the Mongol Empire in 1251. And Mongol, he comes to power in a very violent coup, and he purges the family tree, literally killing perhaps hundreds of his own family members here from rival lineages. And in the aftermath, he starts to set out how to justify this and how to present it that he is the naturally ordained by heaven to take over the role from his grandfather. And the secret history, this is literally a secret history. No one outside of the imperial family was supposed to be reading this. We have references Chinese trying to read it during the Yuan dynasty, and then it gets denied by the great Khan. The secret history starts to set out a preferred version of events, which contradicts some of our earlier sources written by outsiders who saw some of these things. So, for example, it's just a very small example, but you'll have figures like the General Muhali. He keeps appearing in the secret history as a sort of wise mentor to some of the people in the story, even after he's died in real life, kind of thing. So he dies in 1223, and then the narrative has him with Chinggis Khan in the attack on the Tangut Kingdom in 1227. After Mönch's death, during the Yuan dynasty, ruled by his brother Kublai Khan, and then the Ilkhanate, ruled by Mönch's younger brother Hulagu Khan, and by their descendants, you get sources like the veritable record of Chinggis Khan, which survives in the Shengwu Qingzhenlu and the Yuanshi, the first drawn of that as the biography of Chinggis Khan, and in the Jami al-Tawariq in Persian, written by Rashid ad-Din Hamadani in the Ilkhanate at the start of the 14th century. And these are much more public-facing works. These are intended for wider audiences. The Jami al-Tawariq was literally intended to have a copy in every city and town of the empire. And these you set out our preferred standardized narratives, which trim some of these embarrassing bits. So, for example, the capture of Chinggis Khan's first wife, Borta, by the Merkit in The Secret History, it's shown, or it's strongly implied, that she is raped during this captivity, and that Chinggis Khan's firstborn son Jochi was not in fact his son, but a son of this Merkit man. Um, in the official accounts from the Jamyang Tavarik and the Chinese accounts of the Yuan dynasty, this is either removed entirely or it becomes Gortor was captured, but she was rescued right away, and there was no doubts about Jochi's legitimacy, right? So you smooth over things like this. But when I refer to official Mongol imperial narratives, it's these accounts either written in the Mongolian language or written in Persian, Chinese, other local languages by people working for the Mongol government and often expressly ordered to make these things by the Mongols. And a lot of these works, we can even tell, are sometimes very poor translations, even directly from now lost Mongolian originals.
Right. So we've had this empire appear by chance, and then it expands. I think it goes into Central Asia first, against Khwarezmia.
Yeah.
Did this happen because the Shah executed the messengers from the Mongols, like the old story?
Yes and no. That's kind of the end of a long-running series of offenses. So the Khwarezm Shah's uncle massacres a caravan of merchants that Chinggis Khan sends to the Khwarezmian Empire. Contacts between the Khwarezmian Empire and the Mongols had started in 1215 with the sending of merchants, and you have this willingness on both sides to have this exchange of trade. But the Khwarezm Shah apparently is, and this is according to some accounts that are a little later, and the guy who says it says he heard it from a guy who knew a guy who worked for the Shah, so take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But it says that the Khwarezm Shah actually had his own dream of conquering northern China, and Chinggis Khan just snatched it first from him. And but he was just about to do it if Chinggis Khan hadn't done it first, so there's some sort of animosity about this. But so this trade connection starts 1215. In about 1218 or so, you have two events happen. First, we don't know the exact chronology. It's a bit murky in the sources, but one of the events is this massacre at Otrar, today ruins in northern Kazakhstan. And this was this massive trade caravan of merchants sent from Chinggis Khan, about 450 individuals who arrive at Otrar, which is governed by the Shah's uncle, who, in some sources, he does this on the order of the Shah, and some it's kind of on his own account. He kills all of the merchants in this embassy, and then Chinggis Khan sends envoys to demand that the Khwarezm Shah, Muhammad, send over the governor of Otrar to the Mongols for punishment. But Muhammad can't do that because that's his uncle, and he might have ordered it anyways. And there's a bit of back and forth, and the result of this is Shah Muhammad killing these envoys. At the same time as this, again, similar time, Chinggis Khan's oldest son Jochi and the famous general Sube'etei, Subotai, you might see his name rendered as, but Subukadai is probably the closest to the 13th century pronunciation in Mongolian. They have just traveled across the steppes, across Kazakhstan, around the Aral Sea, to fight a group of Merkits, of these enemies of the Mongols who had fled the rise of Chinggis Khan across the steppes, sought shelter with Kangli Kipchak in what's now Western Kazakhstan. So Jochi Sube'etei go defeat them, and on their way back, they get caught by an army under Shah Muhammad, who confronts them. Jochi and Sube'etei are saying, "Hey, we have not been given permission by Chinggis Khan to fight you. Just give us free passage." Shah Muhammad, again, it's kind of murky in the sources. He's a very paranoid man and a very aggressive, expansionistic man, and it seems he finds some sort of excuse just to attack them. And it's a bit of a indecisive encounter. No one really wins, and the Mongols leave under cover of darkness. It seems probably the Khwarezmians had the better of the encounter, but it wasn't an outright victory. The Khwarezm Shah returns back to his empire, and this is, again, probably a little after the massacre at Otrar, and Muhammad is already kind of foreseeing this Mongol invasion happening, and he's like, all right, I'm just going to get in what hits that I can. At the same time as all this, the Empire of Karakai, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, this had been a buffer state between the Khwarezm Shah in Uzbekistan, Iran, and the Mongols in Mongolia. So Karakai is ruling kind of what we call today Xinjiang, eastern Kazakhstan. This kind of collapses over 1218, early 1219. The Mongols annex the eastern part, and the Khwarezm Shah annexes the western part. So the result of the murder of his envoys, the battle between the Khwarezm Shah and Jochi, this is all happening while the Khwarezmian Empire and Mongol Empire become direct neighbors. So now they're directly bordering each other, and Chinggis Khan, from his point of view, he's hearing all these things that the Khwarezm Shah is doing, and he's finding out they've just become neighbors, and he's kind of seeing the Khwarezm Shah as this very aggressive guy making these looks like opening maneuvers of a war. So now that they're actually bordering each other, he thinks the Shah might just invade his territory. Maybe he's even heard these rumors of the Shah wanting to rule northern China. So Chinggis Khan decides, all right, as we'd say in hockey in Canada, get your retaliation in first. So Chinggis Khan picks up his troops. He sends a final round of messengers to the Shah saying, look, you've brought this on yourself, and I'm coming. This is my declaration of war. And they set out at the end of 1219. And by the end of 1220, the Khwarezmian Empire has largely collapsed, and the Shah has died on an island in the Caspian Sea.
Right, yes. So we often hear the steppe peoples would be motivated by like the need for loot and trade to support their social organization with the warrior culture and everything. Were the Mongols also focused on trade at this point, or looking to expand trade, or was it more a security issue of putting down their neighbors?
It's both in a ways, because a lot of these things are often related, and especially in the medieval mindset, the idea of free trade doesn't quite exist in the same way that we have it now. So often trade is perceived of in getting these favorable relationship for your side, and especially in this East Asian Chinese kind of view of it, you can only have trade when you have when you have it expressed as tribute, right? There is no actual trade. It's everyone coming to submit to the son of heaven, to the ruler of the Middle Kingdom, the emperor of China. But the Mongols, they pick up this view at a certain point. The Mongols, the way their ideology develops, is that they evolve this idea that you can only be either in submission to the Mongols or in rebellion against them. There is no third position. So you cannot just trade with us. You have to have submitted to us, and then we can trade. This idea, though, doesn't appear to be present during the lifetime of Chinggis Khan, who is, as we can tell, there's a lot of sources about these early Mongol Khwarezmian contacts written from people in the Khwarezmian Empire, people outside of it, people from the Mongol point of view. It really looks like Chinggis Khan's idea was just to have these trade connections with the Khwarezm Shah, and that there wasn't necessarily a militaristic side to it originally. And this transforms dramatically, as with what I've just explained, with the deaths of the merchants and then the ensuing Mongol conquest of Khwarezm. And after that, then it's very much you can't just trade with us. With us, you have to be submitted to us. Now, in terms of looting, though, this is always a key part of how these armies function because there is no salary or payment for these troops. The only way these troops receive any sort of recompense for the fighting they do is with the looting after the battle. And this actually becomes an important part of how the Mongols kind of structure their armies. About so they have a lot of these episodes and tales and anecdotes of how Chinggis Khan is so wise and he passes these regulations that say no one can break rank to loot before the battle is done, and you can only loot once I have given the word to do so. And kind of the episode they use to demonstrate this is how Chinggis Khan's own family members, his uncle's cousin, they ignored his order, loot anyways, and punishes them and takes everything that they had taken. So the way the army works, they defeat the enemy, you round them up and you execute them, whatever. And at that point, the order is given to loot, in which case they collect everything from the city, from the battlefield, from the camp, whatever, and organize this into large piles. And then an allotment is made. This is distributed. A certain amount goes to the commanding officer. Some is sent to the Khan. Some is sent to even the ministers back in Mongolia are receiving a share of the loot. And then after that, the loot is then distributed in appropriate amounts to the troops who took part in the battle. So the looting is basically a key part of this exchange where the troops are told, hey, you will suffer all sorts of depredations, all these horrible enemies and environments going around the world. But in exchange, you can trust that you will get something out of this at the end of the battle, that you will always be rewarded for loyal service that has merited a share of the treasures, be it slaves, silks, gold, animals, you name it.
So this sounds like a pretty organized system. So how much of a state did the Mongols have at the beginning? In the steppe, it's often said that different federations would develop a state depending on how much pressure they were under from the sedentary civilizations they were dealing with. The Kipchaks never really developed one, and others did. How organized were the Mongols? And
pretty much by the time of the declaration of the empire, we have a rather rigid structure developing. You already have the use of written language. This is a script is adopted in about 1204 after defeat of the or 1205, I guess, after defeat of the Naiman Hunites. So this is one of the larger Turkic-speaking confederations in Western Mongolia, kind of around the Altai Mountains. And they already had the use of the Uyghur script for their language, and they used it for some chancellery purposes, so writing down decrees of their Khan, tax registers, and making official Yarlik, so that is Jarlik in Mongolian. So these are the kind of official orders of the Khan, which are then stamped with his seal to mark them as legitimate. And the Mongols, when Chinggis Khan learns of this system, he has it explained, okay, this is what it does. He jumps on it right away and orders it taught to his sons and officers and has it adapted for the Mongolian language. So when the empire is established, there is already a kernel of an actual administration in there. You have the Khan's bodyguard, the Keshig, is not just his bodyguard on the field, but it also serves as the nucleus for the administration of the empire, because the members of the Keshig are spending all their time around the Khan. They're his household. They're the ones who provide, take care of his food and animals and clothing and his court and stuff. But they are also assigned to govern territories on his behalf, to conduct censuses, There is a position within the Keshig called the Bichechi, so the scribes. These are guys whose job is entirely just to write down what the Khan says, send his orders around. And as the empire expands, and you get this more of an actual civilian government for assessing and ruling the conquered territories across all of Asia. This is formalized in the 1230s. Kind of based on the model of the secretariat system, Sheng in Chinese, a secretariat system, the way that Chinese territories are governed. This is adapted on a large scale for the Mongol Empire. And so you have these branch secretariats essentially serving as these massive provinces. So you have the North China Secretariat, Central Asia Secretariat, a West Asia Secretariat, and initially the Rus principalities are a part of this, but they get their own secretariat at the end of the 1250s. And all of these secretariats answer to the Central Secretariat, which is the Khan's household in Mongolia proper, situated in Karakoram, the Mongol imperial capital along the Orkhon River Valley. And the Central Secretariat, is made up entirely of the Keshig, of the Khan's bodyguard, and the guys running it at the very top layers are the top members of the Khan's bodyguard. And you have figures like a individual named Qinghai, who is a bit of uncertain ethnic origin, but he's originally a merchant and becomes a member of Genghis Khan's Keshig and then Urgadai's Keshig, and he effectively serves as the prime minister of the Mongol Empire from about 1229 until the start of the 1250s. So the early empire has these kernels that eventually become a full-fledged administrative system with these chancelleries, scribes. They conduct censuses of the entire population of the Mongol Empire. There's censuses taken of the Rus lands, and they have whole departments whose job is just to translate these orders of the Khan, orders of the secretariats, into the various languages of the empire so that this information can be promulgated and you collect the tax registries, a million things like this. It's a fascinating to watch them in real time figure out how to run the world just about.
Yeah. No, this sounds like quite a substantial organization. And what about the military side of it? Obviously, the Mongols seem to have been the most successful of the steppe empires that emerged. How are they similar and how are they different to some of the other peoples that came out?
So in terms of general equipment and the way that they are fighting, most of this is kind of has evolved by the 6th century of the Common Era, 7th century. So that is the Mongols, and compared to the earliest nomads like the Scythians or the Hunnu or the Huns, none of these people are fighting with stirrups, for example. They tend to have quite heavy bows. But by about the 6th century, you have the full development of the stirrups, or the paired stirrup, the treed saddle, of fully fledged nomadic heavy cavalry, and the lighter type of bows that the Mongols of the 13th century use. All of these are kind of in place by the 6th century. So from a certain technological standpoint, the Mongols of the 13th century are basically fighting in the same style as nomads for the previous 600 years. And now this is a very effective means of fighting. Like in general, this is why it's kind of one of the predominant means of warfare in the world up until the 16th century or so. What makes the Mongols stand out compared to these other earlier nomadic empires is right from the start, you see a mass employment of non-nomadic military forces. So as early as let's see here now. I think 1216. There is more Chinese, what we would call Chinese, fighting on behalf of the Mongols in China than there are Mongols fighting in China. Like they are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Han Chinese fighting in Mongol service, and they're bringing with them their siege technology, which the Mongols pick up immediately. They go from not knowing how to take a city in 1209 to within 4 years of that they're making their own catapults and ladders and battering rams and all of these things, and they take the lessons that they learn in the fighting in China and they apply this to everywhere they face across in the West. And this willingness to immediately pick up weapons, technology, manpower, ideas about warfare is probably the greatest distinction between them and earlier nomadic peoples. Not that earlier nomadic peoples didn't like to do this, they certainly did, but none of them do it on the scale that the Chinggisid state does. One of the things they seem to pick up, though it's kind of hard to trace in the sources, is gunpowder weaponry. This is hard to trace in the sources because it's so new. No one has a word for it, so no one really knows how to describe it when they encounter it. But it seems the Mongols are even bringing this with them in some small amount, even perhaps even on the western campaign of of Batu and Subadai conquers the Rus principalities. There's a couple references which during that campaign, which some people have interpreted as references to gunpowder weaponry being used. And we have kind of more direct statements of them even using cannons or handguns especially in the wars in China, where they have a lot of access to getting more the gunpowder to re-equip these things. And there's even a few archaeological examples that date to this period, which have been found in that is today part of China, but wouldn't have been considered China at the time. So that's how I would summarize it. The actual nomadic warfare itself is fairly consistent, but they adapt to new styles of warfare and siege warfare very quickly and very effectively, and they become so experienced at it that your average Mongol commander may have literally taken hundreds of cities in his lifetime by the time he got to the Rus principalities, for example, in which case the wooden forts of Rus were not much competition against the guys who'd taken all the greatest cities in northern China.
Yeah, yeah. And how big were they? Because if we look at Mongolia today, it's not an especially populous country. So when we're talking about the Mongol armies conquering the whole of Eurasia nearly, what kind of numbers are we talking? And how many of them were Mongols and how many of them were these other people that joined them?
That's a great question, and I wish I could answer it, but the cop-out historian answer is we don't know for sure, but kind of based on the data in the secret history of the Mongols, there's about 100,000 people in the Mongol army, give or take, during the establishment of the Mongol Empire in 1206, and some people have extrapolated from that then therefore the population of Mongolia, of the Mongolian plateau, was approximately 1 million people. There is some argument now for a higher number, in fact, but probably that kind of ratio of 10% of the total population in the army is probably mostly holding true. This seems to be kind of a good rule of thumb for nomadic societies in general. That any able-bodied man was considered a warrior. You'll often hear it said that Turkic and Mongolic languages don't have a distinct word for civilian man. You're either a woman or you're a warrior kind of thing. When the Mongols start to expand, as I said, they are taking in more of these peoples into their army. And it's estimated that probably by the 1250s, there's about 1 million people in the Mongolian army, but it's not all Mongols, not all nomads. This is including the various sedentary populations who are fighting on Chinggis's behalf. Um, Now, as they expand to cover the rest of the steppes, they incorporate more of these nomads into the army. You probably have some growth in the Mongolian population, in part because early 13th century Mongolia becomes this very unusually warm and wet region ecologically. So we can tell from tree ring data, for example, that it's kind of this spike from about 1210 to 1230 or so, where it's like a completely unusual spike in the previous millennia of what we can tell from the tree data we get from the Mongolian plateau. And this is very beneficial conditions for grassland production. And richer grasslands cause an expansion in how many animals they can raise, and increased numbers of animals support a larger human population. So probably the result of these ecological shifts to the benefit of the Mongols is that it's an ensuing population boom a good 20, 30 years after the declaration of the empire, that's providing more manpower for the armies. And not coincidentally, this is in the 1230s when we see all of this new round of campaigns, so including against the Rus in southwestern Asia. And it also would have had the benefit of really solidifying the new Mongol rule, because Chinggis Khan would have gone, look, my reign is so blessed that heaven is even making the environment more beneficial for us. And this is this kind of excellent prophet, because it seems even in the 1180s and 90s, these were very dry and hot periods. And it's like, this gives way they established the Mongol Empire, and now it's a wonderland for a nomad kind of thing, which would have done a lot to show this is how heavenly sanctified the new empire is.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's very large numbers compared to the armies that anyone in Europe could field at that time. I don't know, maybe China.
It seems the Mongols kind of have two major way of operating their armies. So the one is called Tama armies. So these are kind of multi-ethnic forces that kind of act as garrison troops on the borders of the Mongol Empire. And they do a bit more of this slower kind of methodical approach to warfare, and kind of at the same time act as a military governing structure. So this is, for example, how most of Iran and the Caucasus are conquered, through the Tama army of Chormakhan Noyan, who is he doesn't have a massive force, but he's kind of doing these a bit more diplomatic kind of. Not soft power, but it's not a campaign which is associated with huge waves of destruction. It's a kind of more methodical, slower progress. And then you have what Timothy May has compared to this kind of tsunami approach. And this is when you have a full, huge army under the Khan himself. And these are set out to conquer a lot and conquer it quickly. And this is, for example, the start of the war in North China. It starts like this. The armies of Batu and Subadai, when they conquer the western steppes, the Rus principalities, and end up in Europe, they probably start like this, or they do start like this. And these armies, it seems, are tending to operate around 100,000 to 150,000 strong of armed combatants, not counting the families and camp followers who follow in the Aguruk, the main camp that comes behind the army. So in 1235, 1236, when the Mongols are beginning the conquest of the Kipchak, of the Volga Bulgars, of the Mordvins, of the Rus, end up in Hungary and Poland, that army is starting in the neighborhood of 100,000, and it suffers some casualty losses, but also a large part of that army returns to Mongolia um, in oh good heavens, what's the year? I think it's 1240. I think it comes back. This is portions of the army under Mönche Han in Guyuk, uh, and that they might even have half the size of that army. So as well as with troops who have to stay behind to kind of garrison these new conquered territories, by the time the armies actually enter Hungary and Poland at the start of 1241, they've probably been reduced to about 60,000 men split up, with maybe 20 to 30,000 in Poland, and then the rest into the Hungarian kingdom.
Okay, since we're kind of moving there, let's talk about this. Then why did they decide to head west? Was this just also opportunistic, or was it just incrementally moving on from Khwarezmia once they'd established themselves there? Or was there an aim, or was it just ad hoc?
But this is the Mongols are aware of something in the west since the start of the early 1220s. So rather famously, you have the generals Jebe and Subadai. They are sent to pursue Khwarizm Shah Muhammad, and after he dies in 1220 in the Caspian Sea, they are given permission to kind of do their own thing and to go and attack the Kipchak in the steppe. Because the Mongols already knew about the Kipchak, they'd already been fighting them. The Kipchak had sheltered the Merkit, as I said, and Kipchak, Kangli were kind of the main military arm of the Khwarezmian Empire. So the Mongols kind of thought, all right, these guys, they're troublesome. We should bring them to heel. So Jebe and Subadai, they cross the Caucasus Mountains, enter into what is today southern Russia, southern Ukraine, and this results in the battle on the Kalka River in early 1223, and where they fight an army under Rus princes, all named Mstislav, three of them, and the coalition of various Kipchak, and the Mongols withdraw from this battle. They're victorious, but one of the arguments made by a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Pao, is that Jebe Noyon is actually killed in the lead up to this battle, and that the Kalka River battle is actually kind of a close run thing for the Mongols at first, until they succeed in drawing out the Rus and their Kipchak allies over this 9-day famed retreat. Then after this, Subadai, maybe with Jebe, maybe he's already dead, he starts to return to the east to go back to Mongolia, and then he is ambushed by armies under the Volga Bulgars, and they inflict some sort of losses on him. We don't really have good coverage of this battle in the sources. We only have one account that really gives any amount of detail, but a couple make reference to it, so we're pretty confident it actually happens. And it seems to have been kind of an embarrassing thing for Subadai, because as you remember at the start, I mentioned our Mongol imperial sources. Well, none of that campaign appears in the Mongol imperial sources at all. They simply stop mentioning it after Jebe and Subadai leave the Caucasus. So whatever happened in the steppe, today that's one of the most famous stories of the Mongols, and it doesn't appear in the Mongolian accounts at all, because they thought, that wasn't really that. Probably from their point of view, it's, look, Jebe, either way, he dies somehow on the campaign, maybe in a really embarrassing circumstance. Kalka River is probably a little more closer run than the Mongols would have liked. Then Subadai suffers his defeats against the Volga Bulgars, and probably he's only returning with a very small fraction of the army he originally went out with. So for the Mongols, it's not really a glorious thing, but a kind of main consequence of it seems to be, okay, the Mongols are aware of these enemies in the west, and are aware that they put up a decent fight, and that they're kind of problematic, in the sense that they're not going to be like pushovers. And this is how the Mongols themselves are describing it in the Secret History of the Mongols. You have dialogue that's attributed to Chagatai, Chinggis Khan's second son, and he has a line that says something along the words of the peoples in the far west are an angry people who would rather uh, like uh, die than surrender or something. They'd rather fall on their own swords, and I am told they have sharp swords. That's actually the phrasing in the Mongolian. Um, so part of the impetus for the Western campaign that commences in 1235 is in part revenge, because it's kind of like, hey, Subadai, he's the guy who has kind of the most knowledge of this, and this is his opportunity to kind of redeem himself for some level of humiliation that he suffered there. Um, the Mongols also considered the Kipchak kind of the the greatest actual threat to the empire, because the Kipchak, like everyone else who the Mongols are fighting, the Mongols even say this in the accounts. You know, they're sedentary people. Where are they going to go? They live in cities. They're not going to run from us. They're just going to hang out there until we conquer them. But the Kipchak, they're nomads like us. They can keep moving around. They can keep escaping us. And what happens if they actually even um, declare their own like counter Mongol empire on the western end of Eurasia, like a pope and anti-pope kind of thing? Like the potential is there that they might unite as well and attack the Mongols. And maybe the impetus for this is that the king of, or the crown prince of Hungary, and he becomes the king of Hungary in 1235, Bela IV, from the, I forget the exact year, I think it's the end of the 1220s. He starts going by the name of King of the Cumans, Rex Cumanorum. Uh, and this is because a lot of these Cuman Kipchaks have already come to Hungary and are getting baptized, and Bela, he wants to kind of have like a bodyguard of them to fight his own father and the other magnates in the Hungarian kingdom, and he's doing a lot of efforts to convert them to Christianity, and as a part of this, he takes this title of King of the Cumans. And this is another argument by Stephen Powell in his dissertation, is that news of this establishment of a king of the Cumans might have gone across the steppes all the way to Mongolia, and to the Mongols have sounded like the Cumans have just elected their own great Khan at the farther end. So we got to go over and do something about this. And the opportunity comes after 1234. In 1234, the Mongols complete their conquest of the Qin dynasty in northern China, and this is like their ancestral enemy kind of thing. And they all come back to Mongolia in 1235, and they have two large Kurultais or assemblies to basically decide what to do next. And because now a whole lot of forces have been freed up with the completion of the conquest of northern China. At that point, they're actually allied with the Song dynasty, the dynasty in southern China, but that alliance breaks right away. But the Mongols aren't really committing to actually fighting them yet. So in 1235, they're setting out directions to send the troops, and they decide, all right, let's go take care of these enemies in the west. The Kipchak apparently have made their own king in the far west, and Jochi, Genghis Khan's first son, his heirs, they have been given the right to rule everything in the west, as far west as the hooves of the Mongol horses will take them. It's the phrasing in the sources. And they want to do this campaign because everything they conquer in the west, that will become theirs, and that's what becomes the Golden Horde. And this is a chance for Subadai to get his revenge. This is a chance to finally put down the Kipchak. And all these kind of factors come together with the great campaign, the Great Western Campaign of Batu and Subadai, which sets out at the end of 1235 and, of course, over 1236 to start to the 1240s, results in the conquest of all of the remaining Kipchak peoples, Volga-Bulgars, the Mordvins, all of the Rus principalities except for Halych-Volhynia, but that ends up submitting over the course of the 1250s, kind of on and off. But it's by the end of the 1250s, Halych-Volhynia, today westernmost part of Ukraine, parts of Belarus. This is firmly the western border of the Mongol Empire. And of course, in 1241, they enter into Hungary and Poland and withdraw in early 1242. And they actually keep campaigning against some Kipchak who rebel in um, the early 1240s. And it's kind of, from the Mongol point of view, it seems like 1244 is actually the end of this campaign because that's when all of these armies finally split up and go their separate ways.
Right. And what? Why did they stop? Because we have a traditional story that the Khan died and Batu had to go home to Mongolia so he had to call it off. But of course, he never went back to Mongolia, and every practically nation in Eastern Europe declares that it was them that saved Europe.
So yes, the Vernos story, Urgadai dies in 1241 and the Mongols withdraw. And there is one source who says this, a guy named a Franciscan friar, John de Plano Corpina, who visits Mongolia in 1246, and he says that this is the cause for the withdrawal. However, we have other sources like Rashid ad-Din who'd say when the withdrawal began, the Mongols didn't know the Khan was dead. And it's seen, and another argument by Stephen Pow is that the time frame we have for when Urgadai dies, so that's December 11th, 1241, and when the withdrawal begins, which is probably March 1241. That's probably too small a time frame for the messengers to have left Mongolia, crossed all of the steppes in the middle of winter, and found Batu in Hungary to get them to withdrawal by that date. So it seems the withdrawal is underway by the before they learn of the Khan's death, and the actual consequences of the Khan's death are to prevent the Mongols coming back to Hungary sooner. Because probably why they withdrew in 1242 is that, and again, this is credit to my colleague Stephen Powell, this was the work of his doctoral dissertation and going to be a forthcoming monograph on this topic. His argument is that, more or less, the Mongol army by 1242, Batu realized the army that he specifically had was insufficient to actually complete a conquest of Europe. Not that a conquest of Europe was impossible, but that Batu's army was so kind of worn down by these thousands of kilometers they've traveled, hundreds of battles they've fought, all of these losses and injuries they've sustained over the 6-year-long campaign. That army was just not in the shape in early 1242 to have continued going on because they dealt with some very difficult sieges of these large fortified stone castles in Western Hungary, and they didn't. Their type of catapult they used doesn't seem to have done very well, and things were getting a bit frustrating. And Batu's plan probably was withdraw back to the steppes in the summer, because this is normally how the Mongol armies operated: is that they would start a campaign in the autumn, fight through the winter. You know, the famous story of them crossing the frozen rivers in winter. Campaign until the end of spring and start to withdraw in the spring, so that over the summer they can rest men and horses, fatten the horses back up on the grasslands, and then start things again in the autumn. And this is not how they're always operating, but most of the time, like 8 times out of 10, this is how the Mongol armies function. This is what they do during the campaigns in the Rus principalities, for example. So they'll always campaign in the autumn, in the winter, and then in the summers they're resting their horses in the southern steppes, today's Ukraine, southern Russia. And probably Batu's idea was withdraw in the spring of 1242, rest his troops at least over the summer, and call up reinforcements from somewhere, come back with like fresh troops, or even wait a few years and then come back. Because for the Mongols, like I said, they don't think the conquest has to be done right away. They think the conquest will be done, but they know the people in their big castles and big cities with their walls, they aren't going anywhere. So the Mongols are happy to let them sit and then come back and kind of take them at their leisure. The result of Urgadai's death, though, and the kind of political turmoil from that, means Batu never gets the troops he needs right away to come back and launch a second invasion of Europe. It seems Urgadai's son and successor Guyuk, he wanted to do it, but he only reigns for 2 years, and then he dies, so that never gets underway. And then Guyuk's successor, his cousin Mönke Han, Mönke basically puts it at the bottom of the barrel and bottom of the list, and he unleashes these huge new campaigns against the Song dynasty in southern China under him and his brother Kublai, while another huge army under his brother Hulagu goes to complete the conquest of the Middle East. And probably the idea was that once they've finished conquering China and the Middle East, then they would come back and complete the conquest of Europe, and then the conquest of the world might even be done for them. But Mönke's death in 1259 and the ensuing fragmentation of the Mongol Empire over the 1260s puts a stop to that. And you never see a real effort to try and conquer Europe again, except for the attacks in the 1280s by the Golden Horde, which are much smaller in scale and probably weren't really with a point of view of actually completing any conquest. But more raids kind of thing.
Right, so before we move on to talking a bit more about the Rus and Mongols, let's talk a bit about how did succession work in the Mongol Empire, and why did this fragmentation take place? How long can we consider that the Mongol Empire existed? Sometimes it's sort of talked about as something really ephemeral, even though there were Mongol states all over the place for centuries.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of how succession worked, the short answer would be not well.
Just like everywhere in the Middle East.
It's one of those things, it's easy to do in practice. Everyone recognizes there's problems with it. But when there's a chance to throw your hat in the ring, everyone wants the opportunity to do it. So for the Mongols, the way it worked is that it seems early on, so Chinggis Khan's oldest son Jochi may have been viewed as a sort of heir or crown prince. We have a few sources kind of refer to him in this kind of position, but then due to the uncertainty of Jochi's birth and the fact it seems to have really aggravated his brother Chagatai, this is the resulting fight between them kind of excludes Jochi from the succession around by 1223 at the latest kind of thing. And the result is our official imperial sources tend to reduce Jochi's role entirely to suit this and remove him. But after Jochi's exclusion from the succession, Chagatai was removed as well, and Chinggis Khan settled on his third son, Urgadai, to be his new heir and successor, which Urgadai does in 1229. Now, Urgadai seems to have been enthroned under the belief that the succession would stay amongst the descendants of Urgadai. And this is a belief that Urgadai's heirs also function under. And there may have been even like oaths and written documents to this effect. There are a few sources stating that. But it seems within, as long as you were in the line of who was seen as the rightful Khan, the succession tended to be limited amongst that, and usually limited to the children of the woman who was considered the chief wife, so the Yeki Hatun, the great empress, or one of the upper ranked wives. They'd usually have lots of wives and like dozens, maybe even hundreds of children, but the succession was very limited to the high status wives. And this could still be a lot of contenders, but it did limit the pool somewhat. The issue for the Mongols was that when Guyuk died in 1248, so this was Urgadai's oldest son, there is no sense of primogeniture, but the oldest son tends to be favored because they tend to have the most military experience and backing, which is always important for these successions. It's very hard to become a Khan if you have no military experience. They tend to also be the children of the high-ranking wives, so this is also in their favor. But when Guyuk dies, his own sons are kind of fighting both each other and Guyuk's widow, who is the regent of the empire, who is actually seems to be favoring another grandson of Urgadai from a different son to be the successor. It's a mess. It's a mess. And in 1250 and 1251, Tolui, the fourth son of Chinggis Khan, Tolui's oldest son, Mönke, decides to usurp power, and we see this in the early Mongol imperial historiography, like the Secret History, where they kind of make it so that Chinggis Khan is given a little bit of a wink and a nudge to the audience, and he goes, "But if something happens and my heirs aren't fit to be Khan, then someone else should come and take the position." And the Toluid lineage under Mönke and his successors, they start to fudge the details on who can be Khan and kind of play around with that. And the result of this is it throws the matter of the succession kind of open. When Mönke dies in 1259, it seems that he had probably wanted his youngest brother, Erik Berke, to function either as regent or his successor. But their other brother, Kublai, he declares himself Khan first. He goes to war with Erik, and after the 4-year civil war, this is called the Toluid Civil War, it's over by 1264. Kublai's the victor, but by the end of that period, the Mongol Empire has broken apart. You have the Khans in the west, Berke in the Golden Horde, a son of Jochi, and you have Hulagu in the Ilkhanate. They've gone to war over the Caucasus. The Chagatai Khanate has gone to war with effectively everyone and itself. And Kublai, so this is the famous great Khan who completes the conquest of China, Marco Polo goes to visit. He is never recognized as the great Khan by any of his cousins in the west. Under the reign of Kublai's grandson, Temur Uljetu Khan, there is a great peace in 1304, and these other Khanates start to recognize his legitimacy again. So you kind of get this on and off unification and reunification and kind of name only of the Mongol Empire up until the 1360s, when the Mongols are expelled from China, and so that lineage kind of ends up in a mess. The main line of Batu is extinguished in the Golden Horde, so then the succession is thrown over to other descendants of Jochi, and because there's no favored among those, it's kind of, again, a free-for-all, and guys trying to make whatever excuses to take the throne. The Ilkhanate collapses in the 1330s, but you still see pretender Khans from other lineages are getting put onto the throne and then removed, and the status of the Khans decreases tremendously over the 14th century as they get reduced to puppets, often of very loose connection to the previous claimant. In terms of what year you might want to mark the end of the Mongol Empire, you could go as late as the 1630s, because there is a Chinggisid ruling monarch in the Mongolian plateau who still claims to be ruler of the Mongol Empire up until that date when he dies and his son surrenders the seal to the Manchu, the Qing dynasty. You could argue for the late 18th century with the Crimean Khanates. As the Crimean Khanate, it's argued when it's after they defeat the Great Horde at the start of the 16th century, that the Crimean Khanate believes it has taken the throne from the Great Horde and is therefore the rightful heir to Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. and some of the diplomacy from the Crimean Khans is kind of functioning to this effect, where they're using the titles of like Great Khan, for example. But in terms of actual entity, the Mongol Empire stops existing as a unified single political body in the 1260s, but an idea of a unified Mongol Empire is in effect until the mid 14th century. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so let's start talking about the Mongols in Rus with why the Russians call them Tartars.
So this is a thing. I gotta take my shirt off here to get into this. I got too many layers on there. So the matter of Tatar, and Mongol is a well-trod problem in the historiography. So for those who are unaware, you will often hear it said that Europeans call all the Mongols Tartars, Russians call Mongols Tartars. It's a Tartar yoke. Usually in Europeans' parlance, this has an extra R added into it. Tartar. There is still people identifying as Tartar today. Crimean Tartars, Lipka Tartars. They like it with only one R. Tatar. However, it's not just the European and Rus sources calling them Tartars. Essentially, everyone across the world has some use of Tartar when referring to the Mongols. It's appearing in Arabic sources, Persian sources, Chinese sources, sources from Indonesia, Vietnam, northern India. They're all using, and in the Mongol imperial sources, Tartar is also used. However, there are differences in how all of these sources use it. The general tendency in our official Mongol accounts, such as the Secret History of the Mongols, the Jomyo Tavarik of Rashid ad-Din, is that it's the Mongols of the Mongol Empire. And Tartar was a group in eastern Mongolia who the Mongols exterminate in 1202. Tartars in the official Mongol historiography stop existing as early as 1202. They are no longer a political entity. There are still people of Tartar descent, but their political entity is destroyed by Chinggis Khan and their people absorbed. Now, those Tartars are mentioned early, like as early as the 8th century Orhun inscriptions. There are references to the Tartars in the 11th century work of Mahmud al-Kashgari. There's a reference to the Tartars living in Mongolia. He states, what does he say? He says that they speak two languages, and the implication seems to be they speak Turkic and another language, and maybe it is Mongolian. Maybe he's referring to a Mongolian-speaking group who have also learned Turkic. Some people argue that it's referring to them speaking two dialects of Turkic. It's not clear. Mahmud Kashgari literally does not give any helpful advice beyond saying they speak two languages. The problem with all this, though, is that all of these other sources are referring to the people of the Mongol Empire as Tartars, and often saying that the Mongols really don't like it when they get called Tartars, and often respond with a sort of murderous rage when people call them such. You'll often hear this kind of people try to explain it as that the Tartars in Mongolia before the conquest were so well known that everyone else around just already knew their name and just confused them in that way. The problem with that is that these sources don't tend to use Tartar like that, though. What they tend to say is they call the people of the empire Tartars, but the empire the Great Mongol Empire. We have a lot of sources to this effect in Chinese and in European accounts. There's a famously wordy title which of the work written by John de Plano Corpina, the Franciscan friar in the 1240s, and the titles of the work translates to um, the people called Mongols, whom we call Tartars. Right? It's very wordy. It's very complicated. Like, it confused people, but the general rule of thumb is that the people of the empire are called Tartars, and the empire is called the Mongol Empire. But in the official Mongol imperial historiography, they start to use Mongol to refer to the people of the empires. Now, an argument, again, this is another argument by Stephen Powell, is that Tartar was probably in service as an ethnonym, as an endonym in the Mongolian plateau at the start of the 13th century. But that the empire was the Great Mongol Empire. So that's like Mongol is the dynastic name, not an ethnic determiner. This is what I said earlier on. So Genghis Khan is literally declaring the Mongol Empire. Now, why he is picking Mongol, maybe it's this Hamok Mongol thing I mentioned earlier, maybe it's something else. Basically, every source gives a different etymology for what Mongol is and what it means. I don't really have a good explanation for that. And this is kind of reflecting what is appearing in our earliest accounts of the Mongols, the stuff written from outside the empire, from like 1210 to the 1240s. There's even people who are reporting the words of the Mongols, even letters sent by Ögedei Han to the king of Korea, for example, or the Korean court rather, they're saying things like "we Tartars of the Great Mongol Empire," things like that. We have a famous example from the Chronicle of Holuch-Volhynia, where Danilo Romanovich goes to the court of Batu, and Batu gives him some kumis, erig, fermented mare's milk to drink, and he says, after Danilo has drank it, Batu says, "You're one of us, a Tartar." So there is some cases where it seems to be some Mongols themselves using this terminology. So what Stephen Powell has argued is that, okay, Tartar is in service as an endonym, as being used as a term to refer to the ethnic group by members of this ethnic group. It is being used by the people of the Mongol Empire to refer to themselves, but starting in the 1230s, probably even following the conquest of the Jin dynasty, and you have this great Hurultai in 1235, you start to see sources associated with the imperial court start to refer to the Mongols of the Mongol Empire instead of the Tartars. Now, this idea of changing the name of the people to associate with imperial legitimacy, this is a very common one, actually. It's not an unusual thing. Perhaps the most famous East Asian example of this, air quotes around East Asian, but is the Manchu leaders Nurhaci and his son Hong Taiji, the founders of the Qing dynasty. They changed the name of their people from the Jurchen to the Manchu in the 17th century. Ögedei himself might even have changed his own name. It seems that at a certain point his name goes from being written Okodai, so with like a K sound, to Ögedei with a G sound. And maybe this late 1230s, Ögedei, he's just hanging out in the imperial capital. He's not going on campaigns anymore. Maybe he's just hangs around and decides, this is something I can do. We've completed our conquest of our ancient enemies, the Jin. Now we aren't just the Mongol Empire, we are the Mongol people too. And in the 1250s, this starts to get put into text. So this is when you start to get the official Mongolian imperial historiography with the secret history and stuff under Menka Han. And Menka, his faction is a very nativist faction. So in their view of events in the secret history, for example, they don't like the role of any non-Mongolian people in the early empire, so they remove them. They're kind of this is already a very anti-foreigner sentiment, and it seems like as part of this rewriting in general, he makes everyone Mongolian in name as well from the very start of the empire. Even before it's a Mongol empire, Mongol state, it's a Mongol people as well. And part of the reason why we see with Batu and perhaps the successors of the peoples who are the successors of the Golden Horde, why you start to see them using Tartar instead of Mongol as the rest of them, is because they've left Mongolia before they start using Mongol in this fashion. And not coincidentally, one of the only guys in the Golden Horde who we see as an exception to this is Batu's son Sartak. So we have a Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck who goes to Sartak's court in the 1250s, and Sartak's officials or his ministers say to Sartak is Batu's son, by the way. Sartak's ministers say to Rubruck, don't call our master a Tartar, he is a Mongol. But Sartak had spent some time in the imperial court in Karakora. So probably he's picked it up in Mönch's courts of being called a Mongol, and he's trying to get this going in the Golden Horde, but he never succeeds. So what we sometimes see, even into the some of the early letters from like the Crimean Khans, for example, they're Tartars of the Mongol Empire. You see Mongol Empire more of this political, geographic usage, but not Mongol in this ethnic usage. So probably these Tartar populations today in Russia, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, they are people who not necessarily Mongol descent. There's probably not that many Mongols who are actually in the Golden Horde, but they've picked up the name of the Tartar from the people. This is a very common phenomenon in these steppe societies where people pick up the name of the new ruling class to show your allegiance to their political system. So, and we have sources saying everyone in the Mongol Empire is doing this, everyone calling themselves Mongol or whatever now. So probably for these Tartar peoples, they start calling themselves Tartars after the name of their new Mongol rulers, even if the people themselves were not Mongolian descent, but instead primarily Kipchak Turkic speakers. So it wasn't so much that, and you sometimes see this in some people's writing today, that all these people start calling themselves Tartars because the Russians were calling them Tartars. Probably it's the other way around. The Russians were calling them Tartars because these people were already calling themselves Tartars. The mistake the Russians and Europeans made was to call them Tartars and add an extra R into there because of similarities with the Greek Tartarus, the underworld of Greek mythology. And this is an association made by the King of France in the 1240s. This is not a new one either. So.
Jack, your answers have been outstanding, very interesting and detailed. I think if we get into my questions about Rus, we're going to be here for another 2 hours. So maybe we should stop there. I think we've given a good introduction to the Mongol people. Yeah, maybe come back at the end of the Mongol period and do like a retrospective on the Rustem. Yeah.
And we'll start off with the Rus stuff. We'll start get right into it.
Give it what it deserves. And so as usual in our interviews, have you brought a book recommendation for listeners?
Yes, I mean there's lots of great books being written on the Mongols now, and great stuff coming out every year. A favorite of mine that I just received recently and have been reading and rereading nonstop is Christopher Atwood's new translation of The Secret History of the Mongols. It's been translated a few times into English, but Atwood has been doing a lot of work very closely with it, and he's made a very readable translation. It's one made for anyone of any background can pick it up because it's a lot less diacritics and things. It's a lot easier on the eyes. But he also has some fantastic appendices on it of introduction, sort of short essays along with it that explain life in 13th century Mongolia and the Mongol Empire, the history of the texts that we call the secret history of the Mongols. And for me, who knew the work very well, I definitely got some real eye-opening new interpretations off of it, reading Dr. Atwood's notes off of that. He has another volume as well that just came out in, I think it was 2020. It's called The Rise of the Mongols, 5 Chinese Sources, and there he's translated 5 of the early Chinese language accounts of the rise of the Mongols, written by various envoys who traveled to the Mongol court and some people who worked for the Mongols. And that, with its essays, is also a fantastic resource. So if you're looking for books with some short essays on the Mongols, but also excellent translations of some of our most important primary sources, those 2 works by Chris Atwood are what I would recommend wholeheartedly. And they're also rather affordably priced. I don't think much more than $20 Canadian at least. And I think it's even better if you have American money. I don't know about down in New Zealand, there might be.
Well, listeners are all over the world, so it'll be different for everyone.
But if you have lots of money, then go for the new Cambridge History of the Mongol Empire that just came out. That one will cost like $300 American. So if you have money to burn, that's like 2,000 pages by all sort of experts on the Mongol Empire there, which is a tremendous resource, and will take you a better part of a lifetime to finish reading it.
Yeah, it's excellent recommendations all. And where can people find more of your stuff around the internet?
If you look up the Jackmeister Mongol History, you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I haven't been active very much. The last few weeks I've been quite busy with some other things, but I will have some more material going up in the fall. I'm doing quite a large project on the sons of Chinggis Khan, so that'll be a video series coming out. I also write regularly for the Kings and Generals channel on YouTube, so if you look up Kings and Generals Mongols, you will probably find something I've written for them. I've been writing all their Mongol-related stuff since 2019, which is a long time now, I guess.
Yeah. And definitely well worth looking up. I've listened to quite a bit of the material myself and enjoyed it. And so I recommend it to all of you. And thank you again, Jack, for coming on. It's been great talking to you. Very, very interesting. And I heard a few things I hadn't heard before, so that's always great.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It was great.